Welcome everyone to the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire Faculty Staff Forum. I have the great pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Dr. Bergestuen, who is, prior to becoming a marketing professor, excuse me, here at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, is a native of Norway, held marketing and sales positions in Europe and the United States. His doctoral dissertation focused on the relationship between manufacturers, representatives, and their principals. His research has recently been published in top marketing and sales academic journals, and he will be presenting his research at the 70th Congress of United Commercial Agents and Brokers in Berlin in May. What a nice trip to look forward to. The title of his presentation today is A Multinational Study of the Relationships Between Independent Manufacturers, Representatives, and Their Principals. We'll have some time after the talk for some questions, so please be thinking of those as you're listening. And I invite our online viewers to submit their questions to the chat, and our wonderful graduate assistant, Max, will read those to us. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bergestuen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for allowing me to share my presentation or research with you. I'll be looking at a couple of projects actually that have kind of merged into this presentation. I'll start out with a little bit of background about the manufacturers agents, also known as manufacturers reps, independent sales organizations. In Europe, we call them commercial agents. So all those are basically names that are used interchangeably. I'll be using independent manufacturers representatives as kind of like the term here today. Look a little bit at the literature. We're not going to go super deep into it, but kind of laying out the background of this research. I'll take you through my research model and talk about the sampling and survey instrument that we have used to collect data here. And then I'll kind of move into kind of phase 2 of this research that looks at how does cultural differences, different national cultures impact these relationships. And then finish up with some contributions, managerial implications, and possible future research in this area. So as I said, independent manufacturers representatives, they're an outsourced sales force. Look at it as a way to outsource sales to an independent company representing your products as a manufacturer. They typically represent multiple non-competing manufacturers. So if I'm a independent manufacturer's representative, I focus on bike manufacturers as my customer. I travel out to bike manufacturers to kind of try to sell to them products that I represent. So I can only represent one tire manufacturer. I can only represent one frame manufacturer, and I can only represent one seat manufacturer. But together I can provide to this bike manufacturer different components that they need in order to produce the product that they are producing. So that's the non-competing. I could never represent 2 tire manufacturers. That kind of breaks with the rules of manufacturers representatives. As a manufacturer's representatives, I'm paid through the commission I receive from my manufacturers, typically 5-6%, but it can be as low as 2 and up in the 20s for certain industries. The benefits to the principal. So the principal is the manufacturer that I represent. And the benefit for the manufacturer is that they don't need to invest a lot of money in their sales force because I'm basically representing their products. It gives the manufacturer more flexibility to adjust sales capacity when there are ups and downs in the market. They can just work with more manufacturers reps. Or scale back and fire some reps, and some of them do that and adjust their sales capacity to market conditions. It also gives the manufacturer access to salespeople that are already connected with potential customers. These have local relationships to possible customers for the manufacturer that they represent. Many of them have long experience as salespeople working with or several manufacturers in the past. Many of them are engineers or technically trained salespeople with a lot of experience and well connected into local customers. For the customer, so the bike manufacturer, in my case, it's an efficient way to meet with salespeople because they can meet with one manufacturer's rep and hear about tires or seats or frames, etc. Instead of meeting with 5 different salespeople coming from each of those different manufacturers, they meet with one. And because they meet more frequently typically than with this manufacturer's rep, they typically also develop closer relationships where the rep understands more about their business, their production processes, and any special requirements. So they don't need to kind of share that again and again with different salespeople. So past research in this area, looking at one of the key components in my research is kind of how do these manufacturers use sales controls to manage the relationship and give the salespeople an incentive and motivation to basically sell their products. Past research has kind of been all over the place. So when it comes to how these sales controls actually impact real sales. Some research has shown no relationship. Some has shown small, limited positive relationships. There have even been studies that show that certain types of sales control have a negative impact on sales. So it's all over the place. But just focusing on those sales controls is very limiting when you look at these relationships. The practitioners in this industry, they talk a lot about the importance of those interpersonal dimensions. And one of the articles that was published in Agency Sales a couple of years ago, or 5 years ago, I guess now, talks about some of those dimensions, giving the rep a feeling of being kind of part of the family. The manufacturer responding to the rep quickly when they have questions. They're in the sales process and need information. Importance of getting responses quickly. A feeling that there's a collaboration going on more than a dictation of what the rep should do. The rep has their own goals, their own ways of doing business that have probably been proven over many, many years. They don't want the principal to come and tell them exactly what to do. So collaboration is important, and also fairness in this relationship, allowing the rep to make a fair profit and a feeling of being treated fairly by the principal. So those dimensions, they're not sales controls. They're more kind of descriptors of a personal relationship between the people working in the rep agency or rep organization and the people working in the manufacturer's organization and the interaction that takes place between those. So this is the headline of the article I just mentioned, where the author, who's the head of this, the largest association of agencies here in the US, says it's not business, it's personal, meaning that it's those personal relationships that create success in these relationships. So the research model that we're using, and this research is done together with a couple of professors at a university down in Texas, where I got my PhD, and also with the president of the largest association of reps here in the US. So he's opened up a lot of doors for us to collect data. So we've made him a co-author on a couple of these pieces as a thank you. And he's well deserved of those co-authorships. So the research model is based on basically 2 main components. You have kind of like the hardcore sales controls, where we're looking at agency theory. Agency theory talks about outcome-based sales controls and behavior based sales controls. So we have those based on agency theory that are then giving incentives in relationships between an agent and a principal. That's where the terminology comes from, agency theory. And then we've added these interpersonal dimensions, which we take from psychological climates, which is a framework developed by Coyce and Decotis in the 90s, describing dimensions of a psychological relationship. We're using cohesion, fairness, trust, and support. Cohesion is that kind of feeling of being part of the family. Fairness, that you feel that you're being treated in a fair way. Trust, obviously, that there's a trust in the relationship between rep and principal. And support is also obviously important in these relationships, that you feel that the manufacturer actually supports the rep and wants the rep to be successful. Because if the rep is successful and they sell a lot of products, the manufacturer is also successful. So all those four dimensions are kind of what we have then created into a construct that we call interpersonal relationship. So the purpose of the research is to investigate the role of sales controls and these dimensions of psychological climate, and look at the downstream impact on sales or sales performance. And we're looking both at sales data for the principal and commission data for the rep. They're tied together, of course, with some kind of percentage, but we've collected both types of data. And this research is an extension of most research that has been done to date, which has focused on the US, because the data that I'm presenting today represents reps in 15 different countries, 14 of them in Europe, which opens up a lot of opportunities to look at differences and similarities between different national markets. And that's kind of part 2 of the presentation today. Okay, so the research model, I'll build it up for you. So basically, we're hypothesizing that sales controls, both the outcome-based up here and the behavior-based. So the outcome-based is compensation, obviously. The dollars paid to the rep for selling the manufacturer's products. We think that is has a positive, should have a positive impact on the interpersonal climate. If you're happy with the compensation, that should have a positive impact on the interpersonal climate. Same goes for recognition. That you receive an email or a thank you note, or maybe a little plaque or a prize when you've made a sale for the principal, should also have a positive impact on that climate. Training. These reps, they have a lot of sales experience, so they don't need sales training per se, but they need to learn the manufacturer's products. So they need product training in order to represent those products in a good way. And resources provided by their principal is the last kind of sales control. It can be providing equipment that the rep needs to take out to the customer to demonstrate products that they're going to sell. It can be sales leads. It can be sales support material. It can be actual sales people or engineers coming out from the manufacturer's own organization that goes into joint sales meeting with the rep. All those are resources, examples of resources. If those are provided freely to the manufacturer's rep, that should have a positive impact on the climate. We also wanted to test whether there is a direct impact on sales performance of the same sales controls. That's why we have the sales controls in place, really, to positively influence the sales. We have compensation, obviously, in order to drive sales and have the reps sell more, and all the other dimensions also should have a positive impact on sales performance. Based on the practitioner's article that we just looked at, we also expect that there's a positive relationship between relationships where there is fairness, where there is trust, where there is support, etc., and what we refer to as weighted mind share, which you can look at as sales resources allocated to this principal's products. So how much sales time do you actually give to this salesperson or to this principal? And that will then obviously drive sales performance. So we think that based on the practitioners' literature, that there should be a positive relationship between interpersonal climate and mind share, which they again should drive sales performance. Past research on these rep principal relationships has also shown that the better the interpersonal climate, the more positive these relationships, they last longer. Not surprising, probably, but we think also based on that, these relationships, when they kind of mature and people and the rep understands the principal better and knows who to call with the different types of problems and learn the product better, that over time also should have a positive impact on both the resources allocated to the rep, about to fall here, and also sales for that rep. So through that experience, we expect a positive relationship just through the longevity of these relationships. A couple of control measures that we included in the model too was the number of principals. A rep working with a lot of principals has to split their sales time on many principals and many manufacturers. So we think that there should be a negative impact on mind share or sales resources allocated and the number of reps. And the same thing for performance. That if you have 10 manufacturers that you represent, there's less chance that you will allocate 50% to the largest rep because there's so many to share your sales resources between. The second control or last control variable is product complexity. Past research on these relationships indicate that product complexity has a negative impact on sales. So the more complex products seem to be are based on past research sold to a smaller extent than the products that are easier to sell or are not as complex. The reps kind of steer away from some of the product complexity and go with the more streamlined products. So this is the research model that we tested out. The sampling frame that we used to collect data here, we started out here in the US with the largest association of reps here in the US. And they opened the doors for us to work with an organization that they are part of called International United Commercial Agents and Brokers. They're an international organization with reps in 20 plus countries, most of them in Europe, but they also have MANA here in the US as a member and a couple of members in Africa. So we worked with this international organization. They told us that if we were to do a survey in Europe, we would not get a very good response if we just did the survey in English. So we used professional translators to translate the survey into German, Spanish, Italian, and French. And it was tested back and forth between native speakers of these other languages, and they also took the English survey to compare that we were asking the same types of questions, that we would be able to produce the same type of results. And that's how we kind of collected the data. We gave every respondent a chance to select any of those languages, including English, when they took the survey. And it was data was collected in the summer and fall of 2021. And we ended up with close to 1,000 responses spread over the different countries here. So we have about six countries where we have 50+ responses. And then Tony, I'm sorry, I'm merging then UK and Ireland. So no hard feelings, I hope. So if you add those together, I have over 50 in the British Isles. So those 6 countries I will be focusing a little bit more on in a little bit. These others are still part of the total sample, and I've included them in the model, but I don't want to break out the results for those because they're tiny for some of the countries. Okay, so here's the research model with the path estimates. I'm using SmartPLS to develop the research model and test the hypotheses. What it shows, and this is based on the 980 responses for all the responses that you just saw. So the data shows significant relationships between all 4 sales controls and interpersonal climates. And the strongest impact comes from recognition. That's if you kind of feel that your performance is recognized by the principal, that has the strongest impact on the interpersonal climate. The only sales control that has a direct and positive impact on sales performance is the resources being provided. We are not able to show any significant relationship between those other sales controls and performance. The data also does not show any significant relationship between interpersonal climate and mindshare, current mindshare. But it does show that there's a mediated relationship here that goes via years with principal. So positive interpersonal climates last longer, and relationships that last longer typically then produce a situation where you allocate more and more sales resources to that principle. And weighted mind share, again, not surprisingly, allocation of more and more sales resources will then be positively correlated with performance. And we're looking at the controls. A surprising finding is that the number of principles actually has a positive impact on weighted mind share. Our hypothesis was that it was a negative. And if you have a lot of principles, we thought that that would mean that you ended up kind of putting a little bit here, a little bit there of your sales resources. The data shows the opposite. And our colleague who kind of has been a rep for 30 years, he says that that makes sense because when you work for a lot of reps, you're forced to probably prioritize your resources to a few of those reps. And he said it makes sense then that the that allocation to your most important reps actually goes up. And we're focusing here, I didn't say that, but the relationships that we've been looking at is the relationship between the rep and their most important principle, which typically is the principle that represents the largest sales volume. So we're not looking at the relationship with principles that you hardly sell anything for. We're looking at relationships with principles that you sell a lot for. Product complexity also seems to have a limited but a positive relationship for performance. Again, not what we expected. We expected, based on past research, that the relationship would be negative, and that there would be less sales of more complex products. Our data indicates that there's a positive relationship, and that the reps actually focus on products that are more complex. Which, again, back to the practitioner, says the role of the rep is really the rep of a consultant who needs to be very knowledgeable and who can add actually more value for the more technical, the more complex products than he or she can for standard products or more simpler products. So these findings, they indicate that obviously sales controls obviously impact performance, but via interpersonal climate and longer relationships that then result in agents that allocate more sales resources and produce results. So it's an indirect mediated relationship between sales controls and performance, but there is a positive relationship. When we start kind of digging into the data from these different countries that we now have in the sample, that's now is when I'm kind of looking at those 6 countries where we have at least 50 responses. This is results for each of the 4 sales controls on a scale that goes from 1 to 7. So I'm not trying to cheat here by starting at 4, but just showing that there's a very consistent pattern between most of the sales controls. There's certain countries that tend to be very low on the scale, and certain countries that tend to be on the high end, and that kind of follows all 4 sales controls. And the country that seems to be on the low end consistently is Italy. And the country that is consistently seems to be on the high end, more happy with its sales controls, is the US. If you look at, so that's the sales controls. If you look at the interpersonal climate, it's the same pattern. Here's Italy, and they've really logged out of the group here. They are consistently a lot less happy with cohesion, the feeling of being a part of a family, the feeling of being treated fairly, trusting their principal, and feeling supported by the principal compared to the other countries. And again, US much higher, significantly higher. And these differences are statistically significant. Some of these differences I wouldn't kind of they're not significant, but the distance between the high and low end here is definitely significant. If you're looking at sales per rep in these agencies, it's the same pattern. We can kind of see that Italy is on the low end, so 700,000 euros or so in sales per rep, versus the US, which has around 1.1 million. So there's a consistent pattern here, looking at how happy you are with sales controls, how happy you are with independent interpersonal relationship, and the sales that result from these relationships. So one of the questions that we wanted to introduce in this research was, can national culture explain some of these differences in how people perceive sales controls, how they perceive interpersonal relationships, climates, and how that results in different levels of sales. We looked at using Hofstede. We looked at, but decided to go with a Globe, which is kind of like an updated version of Hofstede. They have many of the same cultural dimensions, and one of the dimensions that we really thought would be very relevant in our research was the dimension that they have named performance orientation. And each culture has a different level of degree of emphasis on performance and achievement. And that's the dimension that we decided to introduce into our model to see if that could explain some of the differences that we saw in perception of sales controls, interpersonal climate, and sales performance. And we hypothesized that the more performance-oriented the culture was, the more impact sales control should have, the more impact or the higher the sales performance should be. We also hypothesized, even though we were not quite sure whether we would see also a positive impact on interpersonal climates. Maybe what would be a negative impact on the interpersonal climate if you were in a culture that had a very high performance orientation. So kind of take the plus here as a kind of a placeholder for we didn't really know what to expect. What we did find when we ran this model was that there's a strong positive relationship, correlation between performance orientation and all the 4 sales controls. Some of the differences that we saw, like when looking at the different countries, Italy low, US high. If you look at the performance orientation, the US has the highest performance orientation of the countries on that list. Italy has the lowest. The other countries are a little mixed, but the big picture is that performance orientation explains at least some of these differences. It also explains some of the differences that we see in interpersonal climate and the differences that we see in the performance that results from these relationships. So the contribution from this research basically extends some of the research that has been done in this area, typically focusing on in-house sales organizations and moving it into these relationships between independent sales organizations outside of the manufacturer's own organization. It also extends the dimension that we use of psychological climate, interpersonal climate, also from inside sales organizations to outside independent sales organizations. Another thing that we're using, which is different from past research, is that we've been able to collect actual sales and commission data. Past research typically has been based on perceptual performance, how well people kind of perceive that they're doing without having access to the dollar figures for sales and commission. So it's a stronger model than a perceptual performance model would be. And last, we're demonstrating the impact of national culture on the perception of sales controls, on the perception of interpersonal climates, and on downstream impact on performance. Yeah, we're running out of time, so I'm going to go pretty quickly here. Basically, we're showing that both outcome-based sales controls and behavior-based sales controls contribute to positive psychological climates, and those climates tend to last longer, which again results in more mindshare being allocated to the rep and more sales. Recognition is the sales control that has the highest impact on these interpersonal climates. And it may also be the sales control that has the lowest price to implement. It doesn't take more than maybe an email and a phone call to give the rep a feeling of being recognized. It doesn't necessarily have to be dollars thrown after those sales. Recognition can come in very inexpensive forms. Making resources freely available to the rep is the only sales control that we found a positive and significant relationship with sales performance. And we also see that and know that when reps in countries characterized by low performance orientation, that it's harder to get the same amount of sales out of the use of the same sales controls in those markets compared to a country where the performance orientation is higher and stronger. A couple of areas where future research could take us is, as I said, we focus on the most important reps. If we focus on reps that are still part of the reps portfolio of products, we could find different results compared to the ones that they focus on and prioritize. This is cross-sectional data, longitudinal data in this area would be interesting to see how these relationships develop over time, and to see and confirm what we kind of hypothesized based on this cross-sectional data, that longer relationships actually produce this allocation of more sales resources and higher sales. Collecting data both from the rep side and the principal side would be another interesting extension, as well as looking deeper at the national culture dimension and see, we collected data where rep and principal were in the same culture. What happens when the rep and principal come from different cultures? What's the outcome then? Is it the rep that kind of it's their perception of the sales control that matters, or are there any impacts of differences in those cultural dimensions? Questions? Yes.
Can you give one example of the product complexity? What does a complex product look like? What is simple product?
Yeah.
My thoughts are maybe the value of this.
Yeah, so there are three dimensions that we used. One is basically sophisticated, or I don't remember whether it's simple or whatever the other part of it, but it's sophisticated, technical, and complex. We use those three kind of terms to kind of measure a complexity. But I think you're right. That's
Can we say the more complex the product, maybe the higher value they are.
I think that's a very reasonable thing to think. Yeah, I think definitely that more complex products, generally speaking, would be also representing more value and higher price tags, and that may be why the reps will run after those, because that will also produce higher commission data. I like that. Yes, thank you. Yes, Tim.
Have these relationships been studied for the case where the salespeople are our own employees? And if these mirror those or different things?
So these rep agencies, some of them, and many of those in Italy are one-man shows. So one employee, his or her own boss. Other agencies is typically here in the US, they're larger agencies. So maybe up to 80, 90, 100 salespeople could work for one agency of manufacturers reps. So this is a mix of people who are they're salespeople out there selling for their own company, and people in managerial positions, basically managing an agency of several salespeople. We have broken down some of the results and haven't found much of a difference between kind of people who are out there in sales roles and people who are managing those salespeople. Does that answer your?
What about salespeople who are not in the agency situation? They're salespeople employed by the firm.
Oh, okay. The only study I am aware of is one study, blanking on the author's name now, but where they looked at in-house salespeople and these external sales organizations. What they found was that the climate dimensions were a lot less important for external sales organizations than it was for internal. It was much less of a driver in those external organizations, where people kind of appreciate their independence and kind of being at an arm's length distance from the principal, compared to whether you're working with a sales manager in-house and you meet him or her every day at the coffee machine. So in interpersonal climates should be less important in this situation than that we would expect inside an organization. So, and that may be you're pointing to probably a relatively weak kind of path in a model that's going to indicate that this is not straightforward. It doesn't kind of produce the direct relationship that we would expect on sales performance. It's a little bit more develops over time, and then an indirect kind of path back to performance. So I think that's a good kind of observation, that these interpersonal relationships, the reps say that they're important, and the practitioners think that they're important, but maybe it takes a little bit longer before those kind of produce results. Other questions? Yes, Tony.
In the case of poor old Italy,
Yeah.
did you think there was a link between you said the organizational size, that there was a single single person organizations, and then you've got the supposed culture effect.
Yeah.
There. Do you see these two things as being linked in any way?
I took out all the one-man shows from the Italian data, and it kind of left me with, I think it was like 300 in total in Italy. I mean, Italy has like 200,000 agents. So even if I pull out all like 250 of them were one-man shows, I was left with like between 50 and 75 agencies that were slightly larger in Italy. It didn't change the impact that that culture had in a model. So it probably is somewhat related, is my guess, but it's not kind of replacing the explanation that the culture has in this case.
Again, I didn't really see Spain or Greece or any place like that.
We struggle getting a good response in Spain. We have like 15 or so. So I'm thinking that in the globe kind of material, they typically they group the clusters of countries, so the Latin European countries, so they kind of merge France and Spain and Italy. So I think downstream I'll probably kind of do that and kind of look even deeper with even larger samples in those clusters of different cultures. But so far we haven't really. Italy had such a huge response that we kind of focused on them to learn more about how are Italians so different from everybody else. And culture and performance orientation seems to be at least one of the key explanations. Any other questions? Are we out of time?
We've reached the end of our time, so let's thank Dr. Bergestuen.
Thank you.